Not again, not again, not again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. In today's episode we'll be joined by Yasmin Nair to discuss Against Equality, Queer Revolution, Not Mere Inclusion. So since 2009, the queer radical publishing collective Against Equality has published an impressive and incisive collection of writings that challenge the politics of inclusion in favour of queer revolution. Whether it is challenging the conservatism of gay marriage, the imperialism often overlooked in calls for LGBT inclusion in the military, or the way calls for tougher hate crime legislation can strengthen institutions like the police and prisons. In this session we will be joined by one of Against Equality's co-founders, Yasmin Nair. She is a writer, activist and academic. Her work has appeared in publications like The Baffler, In These Times, Vox and electronic Intifada, as well as several anthologies including Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment and the Prison Industrial Complex, False Choices, The Faux Feminism of Hillary Rodham Clinton, and Queer and Trans Migrations, The Dynamics of Detention, Deportation and Illegalization. She is currently working on a book entitled Strange Love, How Social Justice Was Invented and Why It Needs to Die. In this session we'll discuss her work and how it relates to a plethora of cultural themes and political issues that seem increasingly prevalent in a period of political turmoil and social upheaval. We will discuss topics ranging from social media to renewed calls for police and prison abolitionism, and explore what radical activism might mean to a post-COVID world. The podcast will be divided into two parts. The first part, we will discuss Against Equality as a project and discuss how this relates to current movements for prison and police abolitionism, especially in relation to Black Lives Matter. In the second part, we will talk about class, polyamory and the politics of love. This session was recorded on the 30th of June 2020. And so references to Black Lives Matter and protests are references to events taking place at that time. This session was recorded as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group that meets fortnightly, currently on Zoom, to discuss a range of different issues and ideas, sometimes related to the historical avant-garde and sometimes encompassing a broader plethora of social, political and artistic issues. I think that's all I need to talk about for now. Over to Yasmin Nair. You're working on a book at the moment, aren't you?
Yes, I'm working on a book project. My agent and I were just talking today about the last touches to the proposal. It's been in the works for a while, but the book is called Strange Love, How Social Justice Was Invented and Why It Needs to Die. But it's looking back at about 30 or 40 years of social justice activism in the United States. And it looks at major, so I won't give too much away, only because, blah, 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 book project, blah, blah, feminism, blah, blah, blah. I've had that happen to me. But what I will say is that it's looking at the concept of social justice. There's also a history of social justice and why it's so important these days, with everything now is embedded in the idea of social justice. And I point out, looking at movements like gay marriage, immigration reform, feminism and the Me Too movement, I point to the ways in which these movements are really not about breaking down barriers and fostering equality, but the opposite, that they are really all about creating new hierarchies and elites. And a lot of it is ideologically, there's a lot that I've been writing about in that vein for many years with gay marriage and immigration. But a lot of the work is also just going to be finally my chance to, combine my reporting skills along with my analysis skills, along with my my ability to relay very complicated history. So I'm really looking forward to it because, for instance, with immigration, it's about looking at how the undocu-queer movement came about and what that meant. So I'm really excited about it for that reason, because it's allowing me to form, where I think I've written about these issues conceptually, intellectually for a long time, but I've not been able to really dig in and provide a kind of a long narrative, you know, with a thread that runs through. A book is different from different essays stitched together. I'm really super excited about that prospect. That's the book I'm working on. Yes.
When will it be coming out, or is it going to be a little while off yet?
Well, we'll know. We're working on. We're in the very end part right now of submission, actually. So it's going to be a little while. I'm hoping in the next year and a half, if all goes.
Because I suppose writing a book at this sort of time when things are really changing, do you feel like it's quite a daunting prospect?
Yes and no. So one thing I like about the book is that it's not something that's only speaking to the present crisis, but that it's meant to be something, a kind of a tome, really. It's going to be a fairly hefty book. Mm-hmm. It's going to be something of a tome that will allow us to think sort of in a coagulative way about what has happened and where to move forward. So it should be even, so I'm thinking, I think the best analogy I have is, for this book, is Naomi Klein's book on disaster capitalism, you know, which people are now, even now, I think, what is it now, 10, 12 years later, you know, even though the events that she describes in that book are things like Katrina and so on, but she does provide this very solid historical context. And the book now, as you know, right, we're all turning to, and we have been turning to for the last 12 years since it was published. You know, we were able to say, look, this is happening. Oh my gosh, she was right. So what my book intends to be is exactly that kind of a historical tome, really. Historical, analytic, cultural studies sort of thing.
Because this is a kind of avant-garde night in some sort of respect, and it's a very broad one, so we do often go off into different topics anyway, but I was thinking what made you relevant, and I was thinking about what I like about Against Equality is, for me, is in some ways you could see it as a kind of avant-garde movement in its own right, in the sense that it's sort of resuscitating sort of a radical queer tradition, and it has that sort of radical countercultural kind of approach. So I was just wondering if that was how you saw it, or...
Yes, you know, and that brings me sort of to the origin story of Against Equality, really, which is, you know, Ryan Conrad, who's my co-founder, actually began Against Equality by just posting pieces on the web. And what he was doing there was, it's really interesting, because what he was trying to say to people was, all of this marriage stuff, which is around 2009, is when 2008, 2009 is when marriage sort of started to, you know, seep up like sewage from the loose. But what he was saying to people was, not, you know, this is not the history. This is not supposed to be the cumulative history of queerness. We have this long history of radical politics. And so he was posting pieces, you know, one by one on his own website, and people were approaching him and saying, you know, it would be great if we had all of this collected in one place. And that's how Against Equality started. He and I were in touch, and then, you know, we worked together on the book. Incidentally, Ryan and I worked on the Against Equality book is now one volume, but it was originally 3 separate volumes, one after the other. And Ryan and I worked on the very first volume on gay marriage for a year. The first time we met was at the end of that year in Chicago for the first book event. And I bring that up because what you're saying about radical politics and the avant-garde and so on, for me, I think what is remarkable, about Against Equality is that it was forged in this moment of complete faith. This sort of two people sort of leaping towards each other, not meeting for an entire year, you know, putting our faith in each other, and it was on the internet. Yeah. I don't know if that would be possible today, because I think, unfortunately, the internet is different in better and worse ways, but I think in some ways, I don't know if that would be that bonding of faith to queer radicals meeting online that way and creating this project. I don't know if it would have been possible. It would be possible today, but it was then. Yeah. So there was that. And then there was the idea that we weren't just saying this is our queer radical history, which of course, you know, it is and it was, but we were also saying what we're looking for is a utopia. And that we've forgotten our, you know, so we were really using queer history to say that this is what gives us a utopia, right? And we were going way back. And that, I think, is something, that was forgotten and continues to be forgotten, that you mine history to look for utopias in the future as well. And what does it mean to be radical? What does it mean to be cutting edge? It's not about, right now everyone's like, oh, it's all about anti-assimilation. Well, assimilation is not the problem. The problem is there's no structural sense of what a better world should look like.
I suppose one of the things that I quite like about, what I find quite fascinating about it, is there's a kind of, it seems like there's an ethos behind Against Equality, which is very much looking at this kind of erased history and trying to keep it going, or recovering it. And even to the extent that there's this refusal to revise pieces of work. And I thought that sort of seems quite, in some ways, quite unique. I think it's that there isn't this sort of a constant revision or attempt to sort of take it out of its historical context.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We were very determined about that. We often have had people saying, well, I'd like to submit this, but I'd like to revise it, because no, it needs to, we take ourselves as an archive very seriously. And to understand the past and to really archive what future possibilities might be, we have to understand that this is what the times looked like. So if there's language that doesn't, that's not used these days, whatever, but the language, it has to stay as it was. And that's the purpose of an archive. So we take ourselves as archivists very seriously. But there's also, this idea, our sense that there's no change possible if you don't understand all the currents, the very dark ones sometimes, that came before you. There's no point to that. One analogy, a friend and I were talking about this as in terms of teaching and learning histories, and about creating syllabi, for instance, about, let's say, feminist and non-Eurocentric art histories and so on. And, we were talking about the fact that you can't talk about what's Eurocentric if you don't expose students to what was the past and what Eurocentrism looked like. So you have, and my analogy came out of literature, where I was talking about Jane Eyre, right? And I said, you cannot, and I know many of my compatriots have done this, where they will just go right in and teach Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea, which is a retelling of Jane Eyre. But there's no point to that if your students haven't read Jane Eyre and they don't understand why, Bertha, the Mad Woman in the Attic is a problematic trope. But if you haven't actually read the really dark text that comes before it, which is also a very complicated feminist text for its time, you have no idea why things are fucked up, to put it bluntly, And I think that's a very American, I don't know what it's like anywhere else, but it's a very American tendency to constantly wipe history clean, and to superimpose on it, right? So even on my own website, if you were to scour it, you would probably find, for instance, old reporting pieces from me, journalism pieces, or even old essays, where I might use terms that are not in vogue today. But those are terms that everyone used at the time. And I refuse to go in and scrub that, because that's who I was, that's where I was implicated in the language of the time. And if people are going to think about how my views came to be, they need to understand those currents. So we're very, very particular about that, because we take ourselves as archivists very seriously. And one last thing I will say is that it also reminds me of a time when a friend of mine who's a queer librarian was on a panel of librarians, and and they were all talking about, what do we keep and what do we throw away? And this one person next to him said something like, well, of course, we don't keep everything. So for instance, we would never keep NAMBLA bulletins. NAMBLA being the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which is widely considered a pedophile association. That's a whole other long history. And my friend turned to him and said, why wouldn't you, right? How can you not understand, whatever you think about it politically, why would you bar any item from, an archive of queer history, for instance, right? NAMBLA is very much part of queer history, although no one wants to admit to that. So, for all those reasons, we think that archiving everything is really, in their original form, is really important.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, I have Xerox copies of pretty much every NAMBLA bulletin, if anyone wants them.
This actually sounds quite interesting.
It's fascinating over the
Yeah.
years to see, how that organization shifted and changed. Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's really important to understand the darker sides of things, and not to just have that just have a positive view of movements that you want to present.
Right, which is what the gay movement has been doing all this time, right? I mean, it pretends that there's a sort of, upward trajectory, simplistic history of how gay marriage came to be. You know, we were all sad and depressed, and then the 70s came along and we were all happy and gay, and then the 80s came along and we were all dead from AIDS, and then we learned our lesson in the 90s, we all got married, and yay!
Yeah.
That's the trajectory. Whereas, what we're saying is it was really super complicated. For one thing, most of us never really wanted gay marriage till the goddamn 90s.
Mm-hmm.
If you ignore the history, then you forget that gay marriage is a construct that was shoved upon us in the 1990s. But, that's a whole other history, which you can read in our book.
Yes. Well, I was actually going to ask something about these, because one of the critiques is the concept of inclusion. So this notion of the way in which gay marriage is a form of inclusion within the conventions of marriage, or the way that, you might have more LGBT people in the military. And so this notion of sort of inclusion becomes a central kind of critique of that book, really.
Yeah.
In that book.
Absolutely. And, inclusion in the military, in the US in particular, inclusion in the military is tied to trans people, for instance, agreeing to be blasted out of the sky, right? Blasted into pieces in exchange for acceptance in the military. That's a terrible, terrible price to pay. It was also something that was offered to undocumented people as well, by the way. A lot of undocumented people were recruited. I actually witnessed recruiting in a cafe one day, where the recruiter was calling up someone else and saying, so I've got, and this is not a stereotypical, the guy's name was actually Jose. He said, so I've got Jose sitting here, and, we were just talking about his immigration status, so can you take care of that? Okay, good, I'll let him know. So people who were undocumented were literally being told, we don't care about that if you join up for the army. Mm-hmm. And if you die, we'll give you a nice little grave, a marker that says you were in the army. So inclusion is making very troubling choices and exchanges. And inclusion is also about furthering a war machine. And inclusion in marriage is really about agreeing to, is about wanting to be included in an institution that's very much in the US about property, about corralling your property, about creating a sort of stable, a zone where your property is your own, and then you pass it on, etc., etc. And that's about the state, and it's about taxation. And it gives people the false idea that somehow inclusion is just that. It's about seeing our love accepted. But there's a whole realm of economic and political exchanges that people have to make in exchange for that kind of inclusion. It's a very bloody, and in the most literal way, it's a very bloody set of exchanges.
If you look back at a lot of queer activism in the past, so if you think of things like ACT UP, it was in many ways like a healthcare movement.
ACT UP was absolutely about, yes, it was. In fact, ACT UP's main, insistence, main project was about universal healthcare. There was a time, for instance, sometime I think in the late 80s, early 90s, when Haitians were being excluded from the United States, and they were immediately put into, what we would call now cages, really barbed wire fenced enclosures, because they were seen as carriers of HIV. And Sigourney Weaver, who's one of the few celebrities I have any sort of vague respect for, Sigourney Weaver and many other AIDS activists were marching in the streets, demanding at the time universal health care. Because that was what made sense to everyone. If you have universal health care, you don't get kicked out of your apartment, you don't get, you're able to enter a hospital, etc. That demand simply disappeared, in large part because in the United States there was just so many died, for one thing, and the other was that political energy was depleted by the time we got the pharmaceutical industries to accept that, yes, you know, give us medications. And then what happened, of course, was that the mainstream organizations like HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, and what is now the Task Force came in with a very mainstream agenda. You had Hawaii. In Hawaii, there was this gay marriage case in 1994. All of that began to suck the energy out of the room. So I'm actually working on something where I argue that basically gay marriage is what ended healthcare, universal healthcare in this country. Which I know that people in the UK and Canada, my friends in Canada have a very tough, I know everyone in any country where there is something resembling universal healthcare has a very hard time understanding how crazy we are in this country, but it's true. We have no concept of the good of the many. We just don't have that particular concept. It's very much everyone is for themselves. So universal healthcare has never really quite caught on. And I actually don't think it's catching on really even now, to be honest, but that's another story.
Was, in some sense, the fight for things like gay marriage a way of diverting us away from some of those concerns?
Yes, there was basically an argument that we didn't need that because if we got married, we would get it through our spouses. Now, I will tell you that my friend MJ Prue, who was a journalist at the time at Windy City Times, the gay paper for Chicago, interviewed Elizabeth Birch. This was, I would say, sometime maybe in early 2000s. And Elizabeth Birch was the head of the Human Rights Campaign. And because MJ had been speaking to me for a very long time about gay marriage, MJ took a question to Birch, and the question was, you know, many people in the queer community say, why should marriage determine healthcare? Elizabeth Birch's response, which is now immortalized in print, was, well, if people can't be bothered to be committed in relationships, they have no right to complain about not having healthcare. That is the most brutal statement you could possibly make. You're basically saying, if you're not in a marriage, die. Because that's what it means in the US, to not have health.
It's quite extreme. So one of the things that I also thought that was interesting about one of the pieces that you had in Against Equality was this piece on the way immigration worked, especially the idea of kind of good relationship that would legitimate immigration. So you have the good immigrants which are married and or in a relationship, and they shouldn't be separated. But that overlooked people that wouldn't necessarily fit into that image.
Right. It was about good immigrants. It was about, yes, people in quote unquote stable relationships, loving relationships. The part about that a lot of people don't know is that stability, that particular kind of stability and love is actually economically defined. So one of the first ways in which queer people in the US could sponsor their spouses for immigration was through something called, UAFA, Uniting American Families Act, right? What most people don't know is that to even qualify your spouse, your partner for that, required you to submit documents showing that you had enough income for, I think, something like 5 to 6 years to support both of you should anything happen, right? So right there, it cuts off a massive number of people. And there were all sorts of other kinds of economic conditions. Basically, you had to have X amount of money in the bank and so on and so forth. So basically what they were saying was, you can bring your spouse in, sure, through marriage, but only if you have a certain amount of economic standing. So that already is a class-based initiative, right? So that's also what all of that love drama, hides. All of this idea about loving stable families hides the fact that actually what we mean by that is, are you wealthy enough to enter the country?
I suppose one of the ones that I find the most challenging, I suppose, is the hate crime legislation, because your instinct is to think a hate crime is such a brutal thing that therefore something should be done about it. But one of the things that's really fascinating and challenging about Against Equality is that challenging of the tough on crime kind of approach to LGBT inclusion.
Hate crime legislation in the US has this history, which is rather interesting in the sense that it came about because African Americans in, I think, like mid 50s, I forget my dates, simply could not gain redress of any sort, right? So if they suffered crimes, it was impossible to even have anyone charge people who, for instance, beat them up or killed them. So hate crime legislation ostensibly came about as a corrective for that. And now, of course, as we know, because there's been such international attention to the sorts of things that BLM is now talking about, the horrific murders that we see discussed and that we see protests about everywhere across the world, right? So now there's more of an impulse to bring hate crime legislation everywhere. And when it comes from queer people, right, for instance, who use Matthew Shepard, who was murdered in 98, or when it comes to the murders of African American people, and also especially of black trans women in particular, right, it's very difficult to say, oh, no, can we at least think about hate crime legislation? But what is ironic and what must be discussed is that hate crime legislation statistically actually has been proven by now that to be something that, again, disproportionately affects people of color. So even though it's ostensibly something that is supposed to solve the problem of criminal act, of brutality against people of color, in fact, very often, we know this statistically, that the people who are most often hauled in for hate crimes are people of color who are accused of wreaking violence against white people. So that's just that. There's that issue, first of all. The second problem is that hate crime legislation is just something that extends the police industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. It adds years to sentences, and in many cases, as I have shown in my journalism, in many cases it actually adds on the death penalty, where the death penalty may not have actually even existed for a particular crime, for instance. So it actually makes sentencing much, much worse, and it extends the PIC. So, in all those different ways. And also, of course, I was just listening to somebody on Democracy Now! From the NAACP in, I want to say maybe Philadelphia, but they were talking about the need for hate crime legislation. But the problem with all of these murders is the brutality of the police, is the presence of, military artillery in the United States. I don't know if any of you saw this bizarre video of this white couple in a McMansion. There was a stream of Black Lives Matter protesters walking past this gigantic McMansion owned by these two millionaires, this couple, and they were both standing. The wife was holding one of those little tiny pistols, I guess, and pointing it at the protesters. And the man was holding in, I want to say, an AK-47 or an AR-15, one of those gigantic bazooka thingies, right? Which apparently turns out he was actually holding the wrong way. If he had fired it, it would have sort of exploded onto his nipples. I don't know why someone particularly said nipples. But anyway, and they don't even know how to hold their guns. But I guess the point is, the problem is not, the problem lies in the systemic ways in which various institutions, including schooling, including policing, including, corporate culture, everything in the US is run on a basis of guns and violence and extraordinarily violent surveillance, right? Everything. I mean, I feel if there are people creating lots of noise outside my window, it is torturous for me. I have to go out there, I have to talk to them, and it puts us all in, because we know that the minute you call even 311, which is the non-cop line, which is the emergency line, they're going to send cops over, and then you worry about what might happen, right? What will happen? Because everything here is very much poised for violence. So those are the problems. That's not going to go away with hate crime legislation, which is an after the fact solution. The problem facing many Black trans women who are killed violently during sex work, for instance, on the streets, is that they have no institutional support. If you're a trans woman who has just, come out, for instance, the likelihood of you getting housing, the likelihood of you getting food, the likelihood that you're even able to rent a hotel room for your work, for instance, all of that, right, is what puts you in danger, because trans lives are not considered valuable at all. They're not considered lives. That's the basic problem, that we're not providing social support of any kind. The problem starts there. So of course, if the person you engaged with on the street gets angry with you for any reason, or just, that violence comes from those circumstances, it's not going to be helped by hate crime legislation. It's very troubling. And what's particularly troubling at this moment in time is watching, sectors of the population, queer people, people of color, and so on, call for things like hate crime legislation as if that's going to be the solution, which just comes back and bites us all in the ass anyway.
How would you want to solve these kind of issues? So if we see violence towards, say, a trans person, how do we think about those issues?
I think the first thing to do is, even before all of that, is to do precisely what prison abolitionists and BLM and so many people have been calling for, which is defund the institutions that are getting support for their violence, right? Mm-hmm. And to even start to think about defunding the state and the cops, we have to start having conversations about why more cops does not equal security. And that's a very hard thing to do in communities like the one I live in. I live on the south side of Chicago, which is historically, I live in a small bubble in the south side of Chicago, and the bubble exists because it's a neighborhood called Hyde Park. I know, we borrow everything from the empire. And it's kind of a small elite place that's linked to the University of Chicago, which is one of the richest universities in the country, right? Now, Hyde Park has two police forces. It has University of Chicago security system, which is the largest private security system in the world, right? So we're talking about, those are cops already. Then we have the Chicago Police Department, right? So, and a lot of that is what makes people here. The neighborhood is 59% African American. It's one of the few integrated neighborhoods in the city, etc. But people here have a sense of safety, whether they're people of color or white people, have a sense of safety because they think that this is what makes us safe, is this incredibly heightened police presence, right? And that's in a majority Black population. So I think even before we start thinking about things like, in the model of things like restorative justice, or in the model of thinking about defunding, just the conversation about how guns and security don't actually mean secure, that's a very difficult conversation to have. And I don't know how far that can go right now, because of the differentials. You have on the one hand, evidence clearly that Black people are being targeted. This is a genocidal country. Mm-hmm. This country is not just born on genocide. This country is activated by genocide, right? It's activated by genocide against Black people. It's founded upon the genocide of Native Americans, and is also founded upon slavery. That's very much a part of the fabric of this country. So with that comes this sense of how violence is what saves us from violence. It's really bizarre. So I don't know if that really, it sort of begins to address your question. I guess I'm just trying to say there's so much work, that we have to do, even just mentally uncoupling from that idea of what security means.
Well, one of the things I think said in Against Equality is that it's important to start asking these questions to start with. That's one of the...
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of hear your thoughts on, so something that I heard recently is, I think that when you're born in the UK, you have a certain attitude towards America's perceptions of use of guns. And the best argument that I've ever heard for it came from a very active rapper that I really like called Killer Mike. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's part of Run the Jewels, and he was very active in Bernie Sanders' campaign. But he was saying that for Black people in America, the only reason the only way that they have to defend themselves against, because I think he sees it as a factionalism between cops and poor Black communities to some extent. And he said that the reason why we need to have guns is because you can't trust the people that would be allowed to have guns to then have guns. And I think that this is exactly touching on your point about the violence in response to violence. But it's kind of like, the way that I see it, a bit of a vicious circle, right? Because I kind of was respectful of this guy's view that he needs to have guns to defend himself, but what is it, the state that needs to de-escalate? What's your take on it?
Right. And there's also, of course, as you know, right, there's a long historical radical tradition of Black people owning guns and using them to protect themselves and their families, right? So there's just a very quick side note is that one of the most infuriating interviews that I heard, Terry Gross, who's this American sort of radio personality, she interviews every famous person who comes along. But she interviewed a very prominent African-American author who talked about how one time, this is back in the 40s, perhaps even in the 30s, but this white man started to come up the stairs, and her father basically came out, and I think he had a gun, and basically, had to chase the white guy away. And Terry Gross, who's this, good white liberal lady, was just horrified. Oh, but that's so violent. I mean, wasn't that horrible for you? And I could just, you could just sort of hear the kind of, the woman whom she was addressing this just sort of sitting there, like, trying to figure out, how do you explain to this nice white lady, my father was protecting me because that man would have raped his daughters and his wife, right? So there's a long tradition of gun owning and protection, all the way down through that to the Black Panthers to now. Yeah, so I get that. And I'm also sympathetic to it. And in Chicago in particular, as you know, the discourse is all about this horrible term that's what's his name? The filmmaker came up with Chirac, which we loathe, by the way, combination of Chicago and Iraq. If you mispronounced Iraq and you pronounce it Iraq, that is. So there's this perception of, there's this real perception of Chicago as a hotbed of gun violence and so on. So it gets complicated, I think, in those ways. Angela Davis has spoken about her family and friends growing up in Alabama, right? Growing up and being surrounded by guns because they needed to protect themselves, right? So I get that, and I'm very sympathetic to that. And I think there's a way to sort of understand that and hold that, and also at the same time to think about what can we do also about addressing the violence of the state. This is not a new thing to say, but Black men in particular are always on the point of being assassinated by the state here. That's the state of things in Chicago.
Something that I've been thinking about with the commune in Seattle that's been coming about recently is I think that there is almost a paradoxical kind of tension going on, where if you imagine that this project, this idea of defending the Seattle Autonomous Zone, it's kind of like a small shoot, like a small plant that has grown through the cracks of concrete somewhere, trying to do something different and operate in a different way. And the full force of the state is then going to, it just goes back to, for me, this essay, Critique of Violence, which is the divine violence which justifies that is then at risk, and it's always sort of left in, because I think that there's violence needed. It's more about the de-escalation of state violence.
Exactly.
That's the important thing.
No, I'm in agreement. I'm in agreement about that. Yes. I mean, how else do we overthrow a violent state? And with that, I got cancelled. Or put on a list somewhere. Anyway.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was employment as well, because I think when we think about inclusion, employment is actually, it's not one of the topics in Against Equality, but I think it's actually quite an important topic. So we get sort of discussions of having more female CEOs or all these kind of things. So I thought that is actually an element of the way we try and understand inclusion.
I think the CEO of every single military contractor is female now, is a woman, I believe. Yeah, there's some, or at least the top 5, every one of them is a woman. So yay, equality. But yes, inclusion and employment, right? So the Supreme Court, right, just made what everyone's calling a landmark decision to allow LGBTQ people to contest termination of employment based on sex and sexuality and gender and so on. So what that conveniently ignores is that the United States has what is called, very ironically and euphemistically, the right it's a right to work. Nearly every state is a right to work state. It sounds lovely. I have the right to work. What it means is the right to work means the employer has the right to terminate your employment at any time, for any reason at all. Every state, except for reasons that are too complicated for me to understand right now, which I'm working on, every state except Montana has this right to work legislation. So what this means is the Supreme Court has made this grand pronouncement, sure, but in every state except Montana to this day, you can literally be fired for being a woman who wears too much red lipstick, for instance. Now, if you want to charge your employer with, say, something like as sexist as, oh, you wear too much red lipstick, it's unlikely that you, especially as a low-level worker, will have the resources to bring a lawsuit against your employer, right? So, which is to say, as far as I'm concerned, this employment thing this decision is utterly meaningless. It's meaningless even for lower-level LGBTQ people. If it's fine if you're a CEO and you find out that your partner, or if you're a partner in a law firm and you find out that the head honcho fired, which is not likely to happen. I mean, Goldman Sachs is filled to the brim with LGBTQ people. Goldman Sachs is filled to the brim with people of color. In fact, one of its main people is someone who's of Latin origin and LGBTQ. So, bingo, right? So all of that is meaningless unless you transform a capitalist system which, only allows people at the very top to enjoy the privileges of inclusion and diversity. Years ago, I qualified for free legal advice from one of the top firms, one of the 3 top firms in the world and the city. It's a long story. I went to a certain nonprofit which does this amazing work. And the lawyers were amazing. And I went to use the bathroom and I couldn't find the damn loo. I was like, where is it? Where is it? And there was a sort of wall of marble. And it was one of those things where you have to grope and find the separate, anyway, everything was marble and you couldn't really tell where the doors were. So I finally figured out, okay, where's the door to the loo? Oh, there it is. I go in and it's the women's loo and it's spectacular. And there's this magnificent marble or granite, I think it was sort of black and white, granite changing table. And I remember thinking, this is amazing. This is what you get when you make your way up as a woman into one of the top 3, law firms in the world. You get a granite changing table. The woman who comes in every night and cleans that place, on the other hand, right, lives in a right to work state where she can be terminated at any point and where she does not get the kind of parental leave that a woman, a female lawyer might get, et cetera, et cetera. So those kinds of issues around inclusion, are never discussed. I mean, again, also many years ago, there was a university, I forget which one, I have it all in records in my email, that declared that its women faculty would receive, some amount of maternal leave for 6 months or a year. And so I wrote to the provost and I said, so who's going to teach those courses then? If they, and she wrote back and said, I'm sure one of our many adjuncts would be happy to take those courses. Do adjuncts get, right, maternity leave? No. Right? So there are always ways in which, until we think about not inclusion, but about smashing the system and making it just and fair and equitable for everyone from the ground up, inclusion is, worthless to me.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what Zizek says. Like, I've been very angry the last week over the stuff that's happening. My girlfriend's going to struggle with her job in the future if there's a second wave, and she said that the reason why she feels this is because there's an unknown behind it. And I think that there's something more than that. I think that it's an unknown, but it's within such a codified system in which you have to think and have to operate within. And I think that what's really scary now, and I think something really beautiful that Zizek points out, is that under modern capitalism, there's this idea that individualism prevails and we glorify this image, but yet there's a way in which something very fundamental, such as class, then disappears and dissolves. And what you were saying seemed very similar, with a kind of class critique of, okay, yeah, you can talk about I've made it as a woman in this organization and done well, but then there's still the brutal idea of what it means to be a woman in a lower class. And that's not to say but it requires a different type of thinking other than individualism and identity.
Really important point to make. And I think the left constantly fails and falters and falters and fails because it doesn't quite know how to wrap its head around the fact that those things simultaneously matter for people at different levels in different ways. So for the woman who is cleaning the bathroom, inclusion and it means something else when coupled with her class status. But then again, for a woman at the quote unquote top, inclusion might mean something else if she's also sexually harassed, but as a woman, but in different ways that have nothing to do with actual quote unquote sex, for instance, right? So sexual harassment, works in different ways and it intersects with class. And I think the left has failed miserably in not being able to understand that racial identity and class identity, for instance, might, sort of knock up against each other in different ways at different times. And all of those things mean there isn't a single moment where you can just isolate everything.
I'm really interested in your kind of power dynamics, the way you explain that, and how you express your intersectionality. And I wonder if you've had any kind of Marxist academic training as part of your background. Because the class thing's really strong for us on this side of the pond, but I haven't heard it expressed so much by an American academic before, so I'm curious.
Well, yeah, partly genetic, because my parents are from Kerala, which is one of the last Marxist states. And I was born in West Bengal, which I think until recently was also one of the last two Marxist states. And then, yes, I will say, I have, what I really want to do, getting this contract, is then spend 6 months just reading Marx. And in a way, because, as you know, right, there's a sort of resistance to Marx here on this side, which is a very weird resistance. There's a lot of this, oh, well, he's just an old white guy. I'm like, oh, God. Why are you so stupid? As if it doesn't matter. Yes. I once spent an entire semester in grad school, one of my best semesters. We spent an entire semester only reading Grundrisse. And that was just, so that's so yes, without really being able to be particularly fluent right now with you in Marxist theory, because I haven't really delved into Marx for so long, because I've been a freelance writer, which means I've been constantly on the hustle. What I'm looking for is time to return to Marx. Yes, I guess that's I don't know if I don't think you were asking a yes or no question, but I was just explaining, yes, I am embedded. When all of this socialist stuff was going on in the US with Bernie Sanders and so on, and everyone is declaring themselves as socialists, I sort of popped up one day and I said, I just want to tell people I'm just an old-fashioned Marxist. Okay, bye.
I think the English version of that is in England, I found myself declaring that I'm an anarchist. in various corporate settings, and that's always causes a little frisson.
Here it's rather fashionable now to be an anarchist.
But
They
you've
both
always had, the USA's always had like a slightly anarchist tradition, which has been quite cool and trendy.
yes.
Which, yeah, where we didn't have that in the UK so much. We were always the bad guys, the anarchists.
Right. Yeah. Here it's very trendy, and they're mostly off. I have nothing against trust fund people. I would like to be one. I like money, I really do. I think what people don't have. What do you mean? But yes, there are a lot of the anarchists in the US. Not a lot. I mean, Ryan is a real. Maybe I shouldn't be. He's a real anarchist. Ryan comes from an anarchist background. He's lived in anarchist communities. I am not an anarchist for various reasons. I just don't trust my fellow anarchists in this country. Not only do y'all not keep the bathroom clean, I don't trust you to not throw me over to the cops when it's convenient, etc. But yes, I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah.
I kind of wonder if it's maybe to do with a threat to the system. So maybe why America is so averse to Marxism is because in the 20s and 30s, there was a genuine possibility of a Marxist shift and I think that with the UK as well, I mean, socialism and Marxism did have a large place, but it was like the influence of the anarcho-syndicalists and stuff that was making a big impact on UK culture and punk as well, which is maybe why it's...
Also, if you think about the British left, it hasn't got a strong tradition of Marxism in the same way that, say, Germany would have done.
Yeah.
It's much more like, you've got the Fabians and you've got a kind of utilitarian kind of John Stuart Mill and all that sort of stuff. So there's that kind of tradition is much more embedded in, say, the Labour Party.
And do you think that these issues with the guns and with the discrimination legislation is about selling products? I mean, it always strikes me like guns are this product that they produce in overcapacity, and that there's been various historical moments in the U.S. where they've needed to make a lot of guns. And I think also like legal services have become, they're advertised all over I don't know if they're advertised in the UK or not. I'm not part of the UK. But I know that we get lawyers advertised to us all the time. So I think a lot about how these legislations are relying on products. Do you think that has anything to do with it, Yasmin?
I think definitely that's a strong part of it. But as you know, right, Zara, I mean, in the US, there's also this weird catexis, right? It's so connected to this idea of individual freedom and guns being weirdly integrated. Which amendment is it, Zara? Is it the first, second, third? I always forget. Whichever the one is. Whichever amendment it is, we try to forget all of that, but whichever amendment it is that guarantees you the right to bear arms and property, there's this very it's just in the DNA of this country in bizarre ways, which you saw so well in that couple guarding their gigantic $1 million mansion. By the way, inside the mansion the views are quite fascinating. They have these sort of Michelangelo-ish frescoes on the ceilings. It is interesting. It's worth checking out what the vision of success in America is and what they were consequently protecting. But I do think that, producing guns, the production of guns, something that Michael Moore also, I think, talked about in one of his very first documentaries about gun ownership, that definitely has a role to play, for sure, absolutely. I mean, there are these bizarre what are they called, conventions or whatever, where you go and you're told, right, this is the new, AR-630. It can kill 10 people in 2 seconds and reload on its own. I mean, it's like something out of the freaking Matrix or, Terminator movies, really. But yeah, it is definitely, yes. Like so much else, right, Zara, in the US, it's all tied to the commercial production of something, yes.
And do you have any thoughts about legal services being a kind of consumer product as well in terms of hate crime legislation?
Yes, in the sense that I think there's an entire industry of social workers and so on that depend on producing more bodies that can surveil and police in different ways than, say, cops do, right? More of them. So, yes, I mean, I think one of the things that my book looks at is the role that social service departments have played in the idea of social justice and how they produce entire sort of kingdoms, really, right, of social workers. And there are all these class divisions as well in all of that. So yes, yeah. People's livelihoods depend on hate crime legislation.
Because I mean, obviously in the UK, we don't really have guns unless there's a sort of a small amount that you get with licenses. But I was looking back at some pictures of Sylvia Pankhurst had it, you know, during it would have been the interwar period, I'm assuming. They were doing target practices. So it was, you know, workers' parties in the UK sort of just doing target practices at the same time that you'd have had the suffragettes and all these other things. And I thought, well, can you imagine how challenging or threatening that would have been to the people in power? You know, that you have these workers' movements that actually are engaging with guns.
We had an incident in UK gun culture in the late 80s called Dunblane, and it was our big first shootout. And before then, we could shoot recreationally. I used to go to shooting ranges with my dad, and we used to shoot all kinds of weapons. And then post Dunblane, our legislation moved in hard. The legal teams went, no, absolutely not. And they kind of closed down a lot of the kind of gun ownership. Now you have to have a ratified gun locked in a cabinet.
Right.
You have to use it. You have to prove that you can use it. The whole gun license scheme here is a little more rigorous than your Walmart pickup that you have in the States.
We have nothing here. Yes, you literally do walk into a Walmart. The reason I do know a little bit about what you're talking about is because I watch Midsomer Murders.
I haven't seen that. I'm sorry.
Every 85-year-old scream I know that. But it's fascinating because, you know, your cops on your shows run after the villains. Ours just go bang. But it's so much fun to watch your cops going like puffing and puffing and puffing, you know, because you can't just shoot at them. Like, and then they're like, Mr. So-and-so, is your gun registered? Is it in a cabinet? Why are you asking? Oh, because we're not in America, right? Where the gun is on the dinner table. You know, so, but yes, that's my source of knowledge, unfortunately, or fortunately. Yes, it's lovely.
What about in Kerala? I'm really interested in the kind of Keralan roots. Is that a militarized Marxist country? No.
Oh, Kerala, yes.
Kerala, excuse me, sorry.
Yes, I believe it still is run by the CPIM, Communist Party of India, Marxist, and it has done really well, for instance, in the pandemic, because it's been running on Marxist principles. So people have food if they need it. People get money if they need it, and so on. It's one of the few states that have done really well, and mostly by refusing to listen to Modi. Yeah, the last I read. It also has the highest literacy rate for women, something like 98% or something. I will say, however, there are other issues around Kerala culture around misogyny, but that's a whole other story. It's very weird. It's an extraordinarily progressive state and an extraordinarily misogynistic state as well.
Is Kerala the place where they have the Goethe Institute? Well, I was thinking of doing my PhD there because because there was this huge Marxist tradition.
Yes.
And so they were teaching people like Adorno and Western Marxists in a way that they just didn't really teach it in Europe. There's two scholars in the whole of Germany that teach Adorno, which is amazing considering how prominent a figure he is. But my girlfriend didn't want to come with me because of the huge problems with gang rape. It was really, really common. So it was like a sort of strange trade-off that I had to.
It is very misogynistic. I haven't unraveled why it is, especially because Kerala has is founded upon a matrilineal culture. I mean, Nairs, for instance, I think about 300 years ago, Nair women, and I take much joy in this. Nair women could have married, I think up to 5 men at the same time. And, you know, and the family, you know, inheritance all went through the women. And so despite all of that, I really don't know, right? Gang rapes. I don't know what happened. I don't know what that's about. Yeah. Wow.
Do you see Against Equality working within that sort of like Marxist feminist kind of tradition of like critiquing the family? And
Oh, I think one way or the other, because of all our, sort of origins stories, we're all sort of embedded in that tradition. So I think that AE kind of reflects our own origins, yes. And I think I would say, anarchist, Marxist, sort of feminist, queer feminist, yes, for sure.
Because in your manifesto, which I really love your manifesto, it's a really enjoyable read.
I love writing it, thank you.
And I have a bit of a thing for manifestos, so I'm quite into writing them and reading them. Yeah, it's on evergreenreview.com. It's not only just well written, it's got nice quotes from lots of pop songs, actually.
Yeah!
And
starting with the Bee Gees, can we just say that?
and some really good images.
Least known songs as beautiful. Yes.
But one of the things that I think towards the end, you sort of discuss the difference between love and what you call strategic pessimism. And I wondered if you could maybe just extrapolate upon that.
Yeah, yes. Well, yes, because, one of the things I militate against constantly is this notion of love and community needing to be the basis for radical organizing. And one of the reasons I militate against all of that is because I've been part of radical organizing communities for a very long time. And a lot of us have been screwed over by that particular community because, as anyone who's been a part of that knows, it often hides a lot of toxicity. It also, I think, is just too much about needing to like each other, right? And also sort of believes that, and really justice should be given to even those you loathe, right? I mean, justice should be for everyone. It should not be about how much do you care about someone. So there's that. But there's also this notion of, things will get better. And I guess my attitude has always been that failure, for one thing, needs to count. And pessimism, strategic pessimism for me is about saying, I may have expressed it differently in the manifesto, but I'm just sort of, expanding on that, which is to say, we don't think and talk about failure enough. What we always look to for change are movements and organizations and institutions which look like they got things done. But a lot of the most radical work is actually work that constantly stops and stutters sometimes, and sometimes just falls into itself, right? But what was really important was that it made some kind of a movement of that cracked open the ceiling, as it were, right? So for a brief moment in time, you saw something before it disappeared. And I think that sort of, for me, pessimism is about saying, it's not about do we get joy and totality at the end of a struggle, but do we understand that things have to bleed before we get to the point where we need to get. So when we talk about racism, for instance, right, I think everyone's very obsessed with, can we all love and understand each other? And my point about it is, there's going to be so much blood in the streets before we get to what I think of as a utopia where, I love Star Trek. It has its problems, of course, but no money is ever exchanged. You go to the bar and you get food and you walk away and there's no money. No one's asking it. No one's saying, hey, you forgot a tip.
Yeah, and Whoopi Goldberg's your bartender, right?
Yes, I know. I'll be like, oh yes, thank you. Right, exactly. We have to go through a lot of anguish and pain and blood before we get to the point where we want to be. And I think strategic pessimism asks that we acknowledge that. And we acknowledge there are organizations here, for instance, that work like Chicago Freedom School. It's not a failure. It's an organization that, for instance, works with youth from ages something like, I think, 12 to about 18 or so by the time they graduate high school. And so it's a long, longitudinal project where they're sort of teaching them in revolutionary strategies, right? But it takes years for that sort of thing to develop. But there are other youth groups that, corral young people from Chicago public schools and put them on the street and have them do magnificent, spectacular media ready, campaigns, and it all looks like a success. But a longitudinal thing where you're actually looking at someone from age, say, 12 to 18, right? That takes time. That also takes stutters and starts. And sometimes the kid drops out of school and you don't know where they go and so on. I guess that's what I mean by, strategic pessimism and my refusal to think that we need to come to some sort of wholeness or hope even. I know other people say hope is important. I don't know if hope is important. I think struggle is important. I guess in the end, yeah, you're struggling for something that you hope will happen. I think mostly, to be honest, it's also just a militant refusal of the Pollyanna shit that I see in organizing these days.
A fortnight ago, we interviewed Jeremy Gilbert. I don't know if you know him, but he does a podcast called ACFM, which is, it's ambiguous what it actually stands for, but it's either acid communist or it could be acid communist.
Right.
This kind of thing. So one of the things that they talk about is things like collective joy and the importance of these kind of things in order to, you're just completely not into that.
I mean, fuck joy. Also, get joy in your personal life. Get joy with your friends. I don't think joy should, I get it. I mean, I get it. I get happiness. I get joy. I get dance. I get all of that. I guess it's always like, I'm always, whenever I'm within certain kinds of radical joy communities, I'm always like, no, don't ask me to hold your hand. No, don't. Let's not, and there's this whole thing of where you say some sort of, mantra at the end. I'm just like, no, which is bad. I think it does matter to a lot of people, right? Things like self-care and joy and happiness. I'm not against all of that as sort of atomized bits and pieces. I'm against all of that as a rubric.
As the core of the movie.
Yeah. I think it comes down
I suppose some people need it to keep going because once you have constant defeat, it is hard, right?
Yes. Exactly. Yes, I totally get it. Yes, Harvey, sorry. And I'm just going to look up the number one.
Yeah, I think that to some extent, I think that with this question of joy, it comes down a little bit to a semantic dialogue about what you mean by joy, because in a sense there's joy in struggling for things, and when you're engaged in something which is really hard, you might not find joy, and it might not be the objective, right? But it's a byproduct of what it is. But maybe what you're critiquing is the idea of joy as the thing that you should pursue, the hope that you should pursue, and actually it's the concrete struggle that you need to embrace. But then that doesn't mean that joy doesn't enter into it, or it's not the utopian goal of something far away.
Exactly. Thank you. What Harvey said. Exactly.
I have a fear of drumming circles and hippie circles here.
No, not the drumming circles. Oh God, I hate that.
But my new favorite idea is doom yoga, black yoga, where it's all done to like very heavy rock aesthetic, which is quite cute. But don't you think the idea of a kind of the queer witch idea of looking at the shadow side is a necessary part of our healing? Like if we keep things in shame, stuff to do with our colonialism and the ancestry that we've had, or whatever, if it's always remains undercover and you always have to be joyful and wear the right yoga pants, you never really dig deep into the revolution, what it could be, what it should be, which is to embrace the light and the dark. Shadow sides talked about all the time on the kind of queer witches of color that I follow in the States on Insta. I'm hearing that constantly at the moment. I mean, there's some BLM fatigue and people are a little burnt out, and allowing the ideology of rest as being subversive feels really anti-capitalist and strong right now in those communities. And the shadow feels like, the dark side. Let's delve and not be too frightened.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough, I guess mainly because I tend to sort of, run away whenever I encounter such movements. But as someone who covertly does a lot of tarot readings on the web, I should probably not pretend to not, be engaged in all of this.
I suppose, Abby, one of the things that came to my mind when you said that was this idea that joy can sometimes be like a kind of denial. And so facing your dark side can be a way of avoiding that kind of denial.
We have so many ways to dysregulate and to disconnect. We get too busy, we get too slow, we take drugs, we have like validation. The utopia that I see is quite integrated. It's not coagulated. It's a real integration of the body, the mind, the spirit. But it's a long game, and I really liked what you were saying earlier about this idea of really investing in long-term education projects with young people. That's beautiful.
Yeah, CFS really does that really well. And of course, no surprise, I'm sure Zara has also heard about what happened. No surprise that on the most intense night of, quote unquote, civil unrest 2 weeks ago, what was Chicago police doing? They found out that CFS was serving pizza and soda, not soda, they don't serve soda. They were serving pizza and drinks to youth and other protesters who were coming into CFS's doors for rest and respite. CPD made their way into the office and served them with a notice of illegal whatever, saying that they were selling food, etc. Anyway, CFS has now launched a lawsuit against CPD and the city, but even that is threatening to the state. It's no accident that Chicago Freedom School, of all places, was targeted by CPD on the busiest night of quote-unquote rioting. This is the most intense night, where windows all down Michigan Avenue were being broken and buildings to the right and left of CFS were being broken into, but they targeted CFS. It's very threatening, that kind of work, in the long run, yes.
I mean, I don't know if it's an urban myth, but I've heard of cops in the US puncturing water bottles at water stations. Is that true? I don't know.
It probably is. I mean, there's a cop who just shot someone in his testicle. I mean, a black man, and to me, that's very much plantation. It's
Really?
not an accident. Yeah. And yeah, another time, so many incidents, right? An elderly protester who happened to be a white man, so this was sort of surprising, was fell down, when a cop shoved him. And then you see this video of like 15 cops just walking by this guy, and not one of them even stopping. So yeah, I mean, the state is a killing machine, and the cops are the weaponization of that killing machine.
But it's interesting how I think that in the last maybe year, I've become quite conscious of how things like this are very specific to specific countries. And I think that something that I struggled with the British protests was that they were trying to replicate this image of violence versus the cops. And so there was a video of policemen without riot shields outside Parliament and having people be very violent towards them. And I think that there's questions that the British police need to ask about what their role is in these kind of things. But when you compare it to states like Bolivia, I was reading today, right, that Bolivia the military has always supported popular uprisings. So the relationship between military and democracy has always been one which is much fuller and a revolutionary opportunity. And in America, it seems the complete reverse of that. Yeah.
But I was interested to hear, Yasmin, about this idea of an academic bubble of housing with the racial mix that you were talking about, and I wonder if that bubble prevents you in some way from like really engaging with the Trumpian cohort. And I'm not. This isn't a challenge at all. I'm just really interested in sort of understanding where you're located within that frame that we see over here.
Sure. No, absolutely. So what you're asking is it not possible that my position within a sort of an academic framework insulates me from? So I'm an academic, but not in academia proper. So I'm a freelance writer. I call myself an academic, for various reasons we can go into. But there are lots of academics who will tell you that I have no right to call myself an academic. But that doesn't grant me in any way any kind of a position of insurgency. You know, I don't see myself as necessarily automatically, therefore, some kind of a radical just because of that. But I do think that in terms of my position, my own sort of intellectual and political position, I'm not protected by an academic framework in any way. And so I don't have an insularity necessarily. And I do think that it's a really good question to ask about how does one, especially on the left, sort of engage that Trumpian, world. I think the left in general has to sort of grapple with that. 2016, I did think he would win, but that's mostly because I'm quote unquote from Indiana. So I sort of understood where the country was going, but but a lot of my friends who seemed much better, able to analyze were saying, oh, no, blah, 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 absolutely. He's not going to win. Hillary Clinton, which would have been just as bad, I think, will win. But I didn't follow my instincts on that. This year, I have no idea. I honestly, literally have no idea, because I honestly can see Trump somehow wresting power away through means that may or may not be legal. I can see us sort of devolving into years of litigation over the election. I can see worse things happening. I can also see Biden perhaps coming in, squeaking by, or perhaps doing well. Either way, we're fucked. But I think, I do think that's a good question to ask, though, to ask anyone, including me, like, how do you engage? What would you think of as engagement for one?
Yes. So for me, I had a taxi driver, a cab driver. He had the Sun newspaper on his front seat, which is the most right-wing populist fascist rag. And I just had the opportunity to have that conversation there and then. That kind of one-to-one engagement is super important for me, and I'm pleased that I'm in a city which offers me that opportunity. You don't always have capacity, right? But it's when it's there, it's there. I think that's all I mean by engagement.
Yes, yeah. One doesn't always have the capacity, and one doesn't always have. I'm always afraid of doing that.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. There is a whole privilege aspect. Yeah, I understand. If you're already catching a taxi in this country, it means a certain amount of something. You can perform more into that role should you need to prevent.
No, here I'd be terrified for any number of reasons, including guns.
I mean, I ride Lyft and Uber. I don't know if they have that in the UK or not, but I mean, I've gotten whatever a Trump supporter or two, and I would often, sometimes I would agree with, I'd be terrified the whole time, of course, but I would agree with them. Yeah, the Democrats are frustrating, but there's all these other problems that, are also frustrating too, And so, I think that there's a point where a leftist kind of radical can, a lot of them are frustrated with the state, a lot of them are frustrated with, bureaucracy. Well, we can agree on some of that stuff, but they start talking about how great the military is. That was the most recent one I can think of, the most recent kind of right-wing Lyft driver I had, but yeah, absolutely. It's very frightening, because especially if you're, I'm a visibly trans person right now. I wasn't always, but if you're a visibly trans person and you got a Trump supporter, you don't know if they're gonna, freak out and do violence to you. You don't even know a fucking clue.
Yeah, people have too much access to the tools of violence in this country for us to really feel comfortable about really engaging.
But presumably you could also be armed and they wouldn't know too, right? When I've ever been to the States, I've always had an atmosphere of like an armed society is a polite society, because everyone could be carrying. I have a lot of white privilege, so I don't know, but that was not true anymore. No.
The left talks about being armed in this country, but they're really not that often, in my experience. That like the most armed people you see are not kind of are going to be black men, in my experience on the left, most of the time. Only recently there was this movement in the United States of like Socialist Rifle Association and these things like that, which are these kind of middle class, kind of white kid, like kind of opportunist left groups, but they're not very organized. They don't have any connection to anything like the old things like the IWW.
Sorry, what about your environmental groups? Are they not quite militant? The Earth Firsters? No. Big shake of head. Interesting.
Yeah. PETA has done, followed, I think, in the sort of tradition of ACT UP for a while. It would have some very interesting. PETA is a very problematic organization in terms of class and race, but they did have sort of ACT UP like organizing for a while. They would just staging protests and even the throwing of blood-filled or paint-filled balloons, etc. But that sort of direct action has been severely curtailed legislatively, especially after 9/11. So for instance, now after 9/11, you cannot even really engage in protests without making an appointment with the city beforehand. You have to have a permit, all of that, which really takes the bite out of protest anyway. So you can't step off the pavement. Cops will follow you parallel all the way on their horses or by foot. They're constantly being surveilled. So after 9/11, it's a completely different scene in terms, you can't have a radical protest really.
Interesting. We have a very strong all cops are bastards thing here. That automatically then means that you cannot have any dialogue at all. And therefore, some of the ways that you might slip into having a legitimate front end then get removed because everybody's like, no. It's an interesting binary.
All cops are bastards. That's just the reality.
Well, I think that I'd like to go back to again that guy that I mentioned earlier, Killer Mike. He did this. He's from Georgia, and he was he delivered this speech where he was in tears because he said, I don't really know what to do because a lot of his relatives are police officers and they've been trying to be police officers for the right reasons, but he didn't know whether to incite violence against the institution of the police or not. And he was sort of stuck in this moment of wanting to speak out and say that something needs to be changed through violent means. But then he always got to the precipice of that and then refused to say it because that would implicate his family in that kind of thing. I think that it's a really, really big question for people that want to something that I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks. And I think that I would find it really interesting knowing the other side of the pond's thoughts on this. Is for the first time in my life, I've talked about our revolution with almost an ironic distance. And the last couple of weeks have really brought things home to me in this sense where I feel like there is so little choice available to so many people. I'm middle class. I don't struggle, but the choices that I have are so limited to me that there seems to be no freedom. And I've been thinking of ways my mind's just how can I operate revolutionary? Because I'm not going to vote for the Labour Party and the face of Keir Starmer, who was partly behind Corbyn being unsuccessful. He was leading, he was part of the movement which made him seem more anti-Semitic than the party was, and that's been proven by documents. And I read a quote by Gramsci today, which was talking about the role of hegemony in US politics. And he says, okay, so the US has two different political bodies, and just made this offhand comment, but it might as well be one. And I've seen that for since I've grown up with American politics. And is there any sort of response to this, any sort of revolutionary response to this in the USA about this binary picking between Republicans or slightly more left-leaning neoliberals? It just seems a bit confusing that the choice is just not a choice at all.
It's not a choice. It's no choice, and it's gotten, I think it's that's become clearer and clearer over the years. I think that there is some conversation around that now, but only because Trump is in power. And the minute Biden gets into power, that conversation will end.
That's so scary, right? The thing is the reason why we're talking revolution is because Trump is the actual face of the reality.
Voldemort.
He's a realist. No, but there's a way that Trump is a realist in this sense, where Biden's playing this romantic expressionist game.
Right. Yeah. Trump is an easy villain, against which we can all say, oh yes, revolution, and isn't it dreadful? I mean, this whole business about, for instance, the cages, the children, undocumented children being put in, etc. As we know now, of course, those cages were built by Obama. But Trump, our Voldemort, gave us the excuse of saying, oh, this is dreadful. Well, it's been dreadful for a long time. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I'm not at all optimistic about national politics. I think there's more opportunity to be had at the super local level. I think that's where things have to start to change, and things are in some ways changing. Unfortunately, I also see on the left a certain kind of celebrity discourse around politicians. So even here in Chicago, I think we now have maybe around perhaps even maybe as many as, I know it's a very small number for you, but for us it's huge, maybe like 6 aldermen who are socialist-ish, and everyone's excited about, ish.
Sorry, what's an alderman, please?
Oh yes, thank you. So an alderman is like a Chicago city council person, basically. So if there's a Chicago council, and everyone is called an alderman. I have to explain this to people. Everyone's like, but even the women, like, yes, even the women, just deal with it. We call everyone an alderman, just deal. But yes, so but we have 6 of them, I think, are now socialist-ish at least. But I've noticed that in all the, discourse around all of that, there's a lot of sort of celebrityfying of these politicians. And I think that came about, quite frankly, I saw that a lot with Jeremy Corbyn. And I think this is, again, where the left is so ridiculous that it cannot. And then, of course, with, Greek politicians during that period, about 6 years. Yes, exactly. All these literal poster boys. I don't understand why the left doesn't know how to engage politics without turning everyone into some sort of a literal poster boy. I think there is something there. I don't think that's at all irrelevant. I think there is something there that is part of why the left keeps fucking up and keeps falling backwards, right?
Yeah.
It happened so much with Corbyn. It happened so much with Bernie Sanders. It is continuing to happen with the woman we always refer to as AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the state rep in New York, Queens. It happens so much with her as well. There's constant need to turn them into not politicians, but our friend celebrities. And, there's an inability to say that politicians are just there to do what we want them to do.
Yeah, but I think that there's something to be said. Like it was the talk that we had a couple of weeks ago was really good, because it was about Mark Fisher's article Exiting the Vampire's Castle, which is why he decided to leave Twitter and rethink how he wanted to deal with politics. And I think that there's so much substance in what you're saying about how you individualize things, and I think that this is almost a byproduct of such a sort of like hyper individualistic, hyper consumerist culture, right? But I think that it's so rare for the left to have a figure that they can get behind, that when you see one, it's hard not to get carried away with them, because they're a popular. And I think that I don't know, like, I think that on the one hand, yes, it's good to pick out that these people are flawed people, and that that they don't encapsulate the entirety of things. But I think that sometimes the left is so easy to attack figures that it thinks are because there's almost a tendency in the left wing to be, I'm smarter than you, so I think that therefore I want to say something more intelligent. This person said, oh yeah, they've said this, but I've got something better to say. I can prove why I'm more intelligent than them, or I understand class consciousness better than them, or I've got a different position in my gendered space, or whatever, that other people don't have. And I think that the left should really think about dropping this attitude, like, okay, the individualism is a bad thing, talk about issues more, but then don't bring Corbyn or Bernie Sanders into it, because they were the figureheads of movements for genuine change.
Yeah, the left has always navigated celebrity in a rather shameful way, I think.
And that's bolstered by a really troubling publishing industry, left publishing industry, which also, I just came across a Jacqueline Rose article about celebrity from 1998. I just bookmarked it, so I need to read that. But even, and Jacqueline Rose being one of the celebrities on the left as well. But it seemed like an interesting analysis of celebrity and the left. And I think that was 98, I think. So that's been a concern for us for a very long time. Right. But also have this publishing industry, which depends upon this kind of cult of personality, for lack of a better term. Right. And I don't, people might argue, well, that's what Trump is. Yes and no. The right has always had a much better system in place for power. So strictly speaking, the right, for instance, does not depend on Trump. Technically, the Republicans tomorrow, and they already have sort of started to grumble and rumble about him, the Republicans tomorrow could sort of make things so that Trump was made to quietly disappear. Technically, they could. Technically. There are all sorts of ways in which, because they have the power, that could not happen with a democratic, structure, for all sorts of weird reasons, because the left, whether it's, liberal, progressive left, the left doesn't really understand power, right? It doesn't understand that power has to be brutal, that there has to be a system in place, and that when a rule is broken, or rather that you enforce things by brute force. The left is very uncomfortable with that idea. As an organizer, for instance, for many years, I really had to figure out what it meant to be an organizer. And I think I'm barely learning after about 20 years, right? God, I just aged myself. Anyway, after 5 years. But it took me a very long time to figure out that it was okay to say, okay, look, if I'm going to be the quote unquote figurehead or the quote unquote leader, right? What I call the fearless leader thing, then it's okay for me to say, this is how things need to happen, and we're going to make things happen. And responsibility for the good and the bad will lie with me and perhaps, 2 other people, right? But it took me a very long time to figure that out. For the longest time, I was all about, oh no, we're all about horizontal power. There's no verticality. no, we're all equal. Finally, I was like, no, we're not equal. We can give an illusion of equality, but all of that. But I think just organizing alone, it's so hard for us on the left to understand that, to understand power and how to get change. So it's no surprise. I don't know where I'm going with
but
that.
I think my dissertation when I was an undergrad was on reconceptualizing politics. It's not an interesting thought. I think other people have done it, but the way that right-wing and left-wing politics is viewed as a spectrum is kind of dangerous, because it puts you in this spectrum where you can think of things in a certain way which might not necessarily be true, and that's true of any way of thinking. But I reconceptualized it as that a conservatism has this sort of centric function of preserving whatever interests you have as individualistic interests, and the left doesn't have anything like that. So when you're talking about LGBTQ rights, or whether you're talking about Black liberation, whatever it is, it sparks off not in a way which is on a polarity leaning that way. It goes out from a center, so it's hard to create a structure around that which you can bind to a political agenda. And I think that the movement with Marxism at the turn of the 20th century is because the proletariat as a whole were being oppressed. There was a conservatism that you could gather around, which is, if you are this type of person, you will be feeling this type of prejudice. Let's reject this. And so for example, with the cult of personality around Corbyn, there was so much that I didn't agree with them on. Like I wanted to remain in Europe, and he's been fighting against that. I think that his positions on nationalizing everything, I think that's just a reversion back to socialism. But the reason why I really liked him is because showed this idea of empathy, which even if you couldn't agree, it was the opposite of conservatism. And I think that there's got to be this negativity around what it means to be left wing. And then when it comes with this negativity that you're fighting against something else, you've got to then be the sort of person that makes concessions. So you don't unite around one banner. This is why a leader has to kind of emerge, that a cult of personality maybe is something more likely in a left-wing organization, because it's a figure that's saying, no, we don't want this. You're not pointing to some sort of utopian vision of a pure race or America that is great again. You're talking about something harder to tangibly grasp.
Yeah, I can see that, right. That's a good point.
I was going to ask you about, which was about social media and hashtags. So you recently did a piece on in Current Affairs about hashtags and about the Zayad.
Hari Ziad. Hari Ziad was and is a Bangladeshi American student who wrote an admissions essay for Stanford that consisted of nothing but the phrase Black Lives Matter, written out 100 times. And he got into Stanford. And he's sort of are we allowed to say that he's a prick? You know, his politics suck big time. In fact, they suck even more now that he's actually grown up a little bit. It's bad. He's gotten worse. Anyway, my piece was about how there's, hashtag activism has taken on this resonance for a certain class of people, perhaps, right? Just like Me Too feminism. Me Too feminism hasn't really affected people like the women working at McDonald's, for instance, who are sexually harassed. It's working for people like Alyssa Milano, who's a celebrity, an actress. It's working for people like Meryl Streep, who get to take, women of color to the Oscars as my friend Helen Razor puts it, as if they were the new purse, the new chic purse. You take your little POC activist along with you because you're Meryl Streep, and you've been told that, hey, Meryl, didn't you know that Harvey Weinstein was sexually harassing these women all these years that you worked with him, etc. So I guess the point is simply that hashtag activism and hashtag feminism really only, it seems to mobilize large numbers of people, but we don't even know if most of those people are actually people. Mm-hmm. In the sense that who are these people? We don't know anyone. But it sort of tends to mobilize a kind of feelings and emotions of anger and resistance and all of that, but they don't really translate into anything on the ground in terms of actual changes. So what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter? And what does it mean to say that hashtag if it's not really connected to producing change in any real fundamental ways on the ground? There's a book called She Said by two New York Times journalists, Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor. And they interview all these women involved with the Me Too feminism movement. And at the very end, they have a chapter where they gather all the women they talk to in Gwyneth Paltrow's house.
Oh, yeah. With the vagina candles, right?
With the vagina candles, exactly. And the goop and the jade eggs that give you toxic shock syndrome. But they gather in Gwyneth Paltrow's beautiful house. And one of the women is a McDonald's worker, who was also one of those who had a lawsuit and blah, blah, blah. And she's the only one who has the courage to say, nothing has changed for me and nothing is going to change at McDonald's for me. She was, she was just literally at the counter. She was working at the counter. So for women at that level, right, things like hashtag feminism don't really have any effect because the corporate structure continues. What needs to change is, the entire system needs to be overthrown. But I think hashtag feminism actually in some ways clamps down on that possibility of progress. It's really interesting in terms of movements, right? And movement history, and what the pandemic has done to various movements, perhaps. It's accelerated some. It's certainly, so for instance, with Pride, what I took joy in is that at least in Chicago and I think many other cities, Pride was just canceled. And Pride here being cancelled means corporate pride was cancelled. But alternative prides came up. So in Chicago, there were apparently quite a few thousands of people led by Brave Space Alliance, which is a trans Black organization. And then I think in New York as well, they had an alternative pride. They had actually two prides, kind of, but the alternative pride was larger, apparently. So it would be great if the pandemic, ironically, is what ends up, sort of tamping down on the regular float-ridden corporate pride. But I also think that that kind of pride will recycle back, perhaps, eventually, but what do we do with this momentum that we may have gained for now, at least? And also, of course, all the demonstrations that happened in Chicago and other cities, the breaking of questions around property and safety. The pandemic is fascinating. We've literally never seen anything like this in the world. I mean, I know everyone talks about the 1918 pandemic, but that was really not even a global thing as it is now. And there's no one is there even a person who remembers what that was like, right? Alive? Maybe one somewhere in the Balkans? I don't know.
I think if anything, the pandemic is a really good moment because things just never stop in the modern world. And I think that all of this corporatism has got involved in events like Pride, which were very anti-corporate to start with. And because of these things being cancelled, it means that when it starts again, at least there's the time to reflect and sort of resist those structures. Because they're still working now while we're all in lockdown, like the corporations are still doing as well as they have done. Amazon's still doing great, but it's the moment afterwards where the people have got something different to work with and say, okay, we've seen something different and we can act in a different way because of it.
A lot of people have heard birdsong for the first time. As a bit of a hippie, I would like to propose that that's like a good thing, and maybe decisions can be made on those kind of bases now. I don't know.
But well, I also heard. I live near the lake, and the other morning I was woken up. This is sort of like birdsong, but not quite. I was woken up by a sound I had never heard before: seagulls fighting over one pita bread. And it turns out that when seagulls see one pita bread, they get really angry with each other. And at 6:30 in the bloody morning, they all sounded like cats. It sounded like a weird combination of cats and babies. So I woke up thinking, what is this chaos? Who is crying? What is this torture I hear? So I run to my windows, and there's these bloody seagulls fighting one. And it was this meow, between a meow and a mew, it was the strangest sound. So I guess that was the pandemic too.
So you probably don't know, Yasmin, but the soundtrack to Brighton is seagulls fighting. We're a city by the sea. This is what we live with. And foxes yelping at 3 a.m. But like the police helicopters have stopped and the air traffic has stopped and nature is totally restored. My poppies, I planted them 5 years ago. They've gone mental. Right down the road, outside the wall, everyone's like, oh.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and we have some small birds now and pigeons as well, of course. But
Right. I know in places like India, in Indian cities like Bengaluru and Chennai, unfortunately, one of the things that's happened is that stray dogs and cats no longer have access to the food that they would get from restaurants and dumpsters and so on. So that's, for those of my friends who are animal lovers and take care of stray animals, that's been a bit of a crisis in terms of, so there have been attempts to keep them fed and all of that. So it's all these different weird things, right? Affects that that have come about.
This is, I think you're more, you're kind of, I was having an argument with, not an argument, I was having a debate with my girlfriend on the Brighton beach a little while back. And she was saying like, oh, and she smelt the beach and she was like, isn't that wonderful? The beach smells amazing. And I was like, I think that might be the smell of sewage. and it might be the smell of people not cleaning things up. And I think that this is like, I think that it like, you're at risk of being a little bit pagan if you're like, oh, nature's restoring itself, because human beings are the biggest constituents of this natural world. And I think that the coronavirus is destroying habitats for the animals that have learned to live around us.
Exactly.
And I think that the big question is I think that this is the catastrophe, right? That if there was this semblance of nature at any point, human beings are now in control of it. And that means that we've got a lot of responsibility in how we act. And the way that we've acted has just been in terms of, in human terms. So I think that I think that it's dangerous to say that there's some kind of harmony arising out of coronavirus. I think that there is just more, I think it's just suffering. I think that that's the point that you need to start from, and it might open up the space for something positive to happen, but it is fundamentally suffering first.
If I may say so, I did write about that in a piece called Pandemic in the Evergreen Review. Shameless hustler that I am. I don't know how many of you are Douglas Adams fans.
Yeah.
It's called So Long and Thanks for Nothing. And it is actually partly about this idea of nature and animals and humankind. Evergreen Review is a magazine. It's actually a wonderful storied, long tradition. It's a literary magazine that was started in the 60s and 70s, and it was infamous at the time for publishing people like William S. Burroughs and what was considered pornographic literature. It had a lot of lawsuits filed against it. It used to be sent off, I think, in brown paper bags, and then it suspended publication for a while. It had some really famous writers, and then it suspended publication for a long while, and now it's mostly online. It's slowly releasing all the old issues online as well. It's a beautiful, lovely magazine.
Yeah, which you've tainted with the words of Aerosmith.
I'm so sorry you didn't like it. I'm not the biggest fan either, but I thought, ooh, this song. I'm very Catholic in that way. I'm a bit of a slut when it comes to music. I have no real, just like, oh, I like this lyric, so I'm just going to slap it on here.
Aerosmith is so slutty, it's ridiculous.
I will say,
they have no shame about the genocide in America. They don't give a shit. They like have the long hair and their sort of vaguely transiness.
And the lips. My great favorite is John Cale, whom I integrate into everything as much as I can. Yes, and the Velvet Underground. But I will go towards Aerosmith if it serves my purpose.
If available, yes.
My last essay, my lecturer only listens to classical music. He really likes modernist classical music. So deliberately, every section of my essay started with a quote of like some grime artist that I liked, or like a bit of hip hop, or just something that was like really out there. And I got really, he really liked it. It was like, this is a very good quote. Where's it from? It's like, oh, Godspeed you, Black Emperor. Like, yeah, it's fine.
But my own website is just yasminnair.com. Back to the hustle. Yeah, but yeah.
You write for quite a few different places, don't you? Current Affairs and Baffler and
Mm-hmm. I'm an editor at large at Current Affairs, which a title that they kindly bestowed upon me. They were very sweet about it. They said, oh, you're such a big supporter of ours. We love your work, so we'll make you editor at large. The problem with it, I love it. But I keep telling people, I'm like, look, because people keep approaching me, like, can you talk to the editors about this piece and writing? And I finally had to put it on my bio. I said, look, I'm like the Queen Mum. I have nothing but nice hats. I don't even have the nice hats and the great jewelry. I'm purely ceremonial. Think of me as a dead marionette. Just sort of being floated around. I have no functions at all. I don't make any decisions, really. But people keep thinking, oh, she's what is it? An editor at large. nothing. There's no money. I have no discretion. I mean, there are people who publish whom I don't agree with at all, you know. So what does that tell you? And I love that. I mean, it's fine. You know, I think a magazine should not be about, oh, you have to have one, you know, or only your friends can be published. But
Yeah.
so I'm an editor at large, and Baffler I haven't written for in a while, but the editor who was there is now at the New Republic. And yeah, but yeah, I'm mostly focusing now on the book and on producing material for my own website, because I have quite a number of subscribers. I just wrote a piece, Hustle Again, called, which I would like everyone here to read. It's called Her Name Was Norma. And it's about Norma McCorvey, who is the woman behind the Roe v. Wade abortion decision, which in the United States sort of determined, in some ways, abortion access. And it's about her being having been a lesbian. And not many people knew that, but it's also about her class background. And I argue that if you're going to keep recovering heroes for queer history, why has Norma McCorvey been forgotten? Well, because she was, you know, this lower class woman who spoke a certain way, and was not the kind of lesbian that queer people like to acknowledge these days. So, and I'm writing a part 2 about Norma, about 2 Normas, one of whom is a woman named Norma Jean, Marilyn Monroe. I'm so excited. So it's about Norma Jean Baker and Norma McCorvey. And I've got this weird thing about desire and class and all of that going on. Like I said, I hustle.
She's an incredible jazz singer.
True. This is actually true.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, you're right. She's also just an extraordinary actor. You know, most people don't realize how much it takes to actually play that dumb in some of those roles and not have it be cartoonish. I won't go on about Marilyn Monroe. I'm sure others have other questions and topics.
So you talked about the hashtags in relation to Black Lives Matter, and I was wanting to ask about the relationship between some of the kind of limited ways in which those become kind of just very superficial. And then on the other hand, you know, it seems like calls for police abolition or prison abolition seems quite in line with a lot of stuff that you're talking about. So I'm just wondering what bits are sort of good about this kind of movement and what bits are kind of going wrong.
By this kind of movement, do you mean the hashtag movement, or
things like Black Lives Matter, or any movements, I suppose. But there seems to be like a positive side that seems to chime with your work, and there also seems to be this kind of superficial side.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I just want to be sure. You're saying that what are the sort of the positive sides to, say, hashtag feminism or to Black Lives Matter?
I was talking about Black Lives Matter, really.
Right. No, I think that's an extraordinary movement in large part because it's not so far, right? I think it's sort of getting there in some places, but it's not a centralized movement. It's not a non-profit driven movement, and it's very much about each city's BLM looks very different. The BLM in Chicago is very different than, say, the BLM in New York, perhaps, you know. So there are those. I think that's also what...
Could you describe that, Yasmin? I'm really interested in that. How is the movements different?
In the sense that they're not tied to a non-profit which sends out a central message.
Right.
So they're sort of like insurgent movements which can act independently and in very mobile ways. And so it's hard, for instance, for surveillance, right, technologies to keep an eye on, even though, of course, as we know, right, BLM is constantly being tracked and monitored and surveilled. But one of the reasons that they are very successful is because they are sort of more mobile as a result. You know, they're not fixed. They're not a fixed entity. A friend, David Parsons, and I were talking about, I know this may sound really weird, but we were talking about the first Planet of the Apes redo, but it was the first one in the 2010 version of the long Planet of the Apes, long history of those movies from the 60s. But in that Planet of the Apes, there's this amazing, glorious scene at the very end where all the apes take over the city at San Francisco. And the reason they're able to do that is because they come at it from all quarters and they're all independent little units, you know. And it's that scene alone is really worth watching, by the way. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. But that kind of activism, which isn't about one central area giving out directions, is, I think, what keeps BLM alive. And I think BLM has, shifted and moved along with the time, as it were. That's, I think, a model of some sort.
I really hope so. I mean, Extinction Rebellion has kind of folded in on itself. It was really sad. The shadow was there and they could have embraced it, and they just went into this very kind of memeified, superficial zone, and then it all just fell away.
There's a long article about Extinction Rebellion in Current Affairs, and I read it very quickly the other day, but one of the critiques seems to be that one of the problems is that it didn't really end up hewing to an actual anti-capitalist politics. That's what I read. But I know I've heard other critiques about race and Extinction Rebellion as well.
That seems to be quite big in London. I don't know about elsewhere.
Bradley, am I getting at what you asked?
Yeah, and I think this kind of relates to your work, because there's a certain sense in which you see a lot of the demands that seem to come from Black Lives Matter seems to be things like, abolish the police. And they're quite radical demands, or they're at least challenging those systems and structures. And then the way that you see things in the media, it's like, we've taken down, I don't know, Faulty Towers has been taken off one of these kind of programs because it's considered racist. So it seems like there's these two different kind of ideas about what this is, and the corporate media wants to have a debate about, is a TV program racist? And then the actual movement on the streets seems to be much more about pushing, actually changing these systems.
Yes. Corporate media is obsessed with that whole business of what is a character called, what references are used, etc., whereas I think BLM is on the ground. I think BLM is also a sign of how to successfully use online media as well, to corral people and to organize them, but not necessarily to be invested in representation alone. Whereas I think the sort of corporate media woke kind of critique that seems to derive from BLM is much more concerned with representation, which does matter, yes. But, there's a politics around that, which seems to be that, well, that's all that, if you just can have better representation, we can be so much better. Yeah. Whereas I think BLM is, fuck all that, defund the police.
Isn't representation a really colonialist thing about property and ownership, though? And maybe that's like a really useful divide to create right now. Like none of that was okay. If you're going to be represented by somebody, you're going to be owned by them in some way. The dissolving of the ego feels much more important now.
So you're saying that representation matters because it is necessary to subvert or undo a certain mode of representation? Is that what you mean?
No, I think we've just kind of fallen into being represented. I think there's still a lot of blind allegiance to that idea.
Yes.
I want to give a different view on BLM in the US. My understanding of BLM is that a bunch of their nonprofits are local to cities, and they're very much immersed in the liberal establishment in the cities, and that their demands have not been abolish the police, their demands have been defund the police, which is very different because that's more of an austerity neoliberal demand. And the other understanding that I have in the United States, which may not be something everyone hears, is that the movement for Black Lives is a movement which is more radical than BLM, and that BLM is more connected to this well-known politician. His name was DeRay McKesson, who kind of became a politician in Baltimore and was very much into these privatization of the school system politics, which are not quite left, I would say, closer to the neoliberal side of things. So, I mean, I'm also in DC, and in DC, I feel like the local Democratic establishment colluded with BLM in a big way, because that's why you got the plaza outside of Trump's place and all this aesthetic BLM-ness in DC. Okay. So that could be my local standpoint more than any objective analysis meant to one up someone else, and that's not my goal. So that's and my understanding is that the protests in the U.S. were really radical from May 26th to June 1st, and then you got a bunch of these kind of nonprofits coming in there and disciplining the Black proletarian protesters and telling them, accusing white people of being agitators and all these very weird kind of creepy discourses about what good protesting is got involved after June 1st in the protests. So that's a slightly different view.
On July the 4th is American Independence Day. Do you feel like there's a kind of a little bit of a lull now as people are getting ready for the next big date?
I mean, I think that there was initially a push by a lot of young kind of not well off kind of people on the streets, the first earlier portion, and then there was this wave like white liberal allies who were coming in there and chanting vote, chanting things like that, you know, and that now the only people out there in DC, and I'm friends with some of the people who are out there, are these kind of stalwart people who don't have work, or, you know, the stalwart people who are out there, and the wave of nonprofit allyship is kind of it's not as present. There's still a bunch of people who are trying to raise havoc in different places, and there was still like a couple people that went to Jeff Bezos has a mansion in DuPont apparently, and went there and they set up a faux guillotine or something. But I think that there has been a lull. I think you're right that there has been a lull, and I think it's partially that a lot of the original people who were out there who were poor and black witnessed it getting very taken over by some white liberals after the 1st of June for the couple of weeks. And like all the really radical stuff in a lot of cities, maybe not in Minneapolis, was taken over by liberals. And I think that's even true of the autonomous zone, and I say in quotation marks, in Seattle. There's a lot of liberals who were involved with that. You know, giving some, you know, aesthetic leadership, gestural leadership to some black people too, but it was really dominated by white liberal co-opting force.
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement with that. I'm glad you brought up DeRay McKesson's name as well, Zara, because yeah, I think that it does need to be pointed out that I think it maybe does look a little different in different cities, and I probably don't know enough about what's going on in Chicago, but it seems like in Chicago there's still some parts of the movement that's still sort of I don't want to say controlled, but certainly dominated by the more radical wing, perhaps, like BYP, which is Black Youth Project, and Asada's Daughters, right? Those sort of radical groups still have a Brave Space Alliance, which is Black trans, but is also non-profit. You know, all of these, I think, organizations sort of are in these weird positions where power is constantly sliding back and forth in interesting ways. But DeRay McKesson, I think Zara is absolutely right. So McKesson is an activist who aligns himself, who keeps aligning himself with the BLM movement. But he is, yes, as Zara points out, definitely by no means a radical, wears a blue vest and is sort of famous for that sartorial choice. What McKesson's group came up with was what looked like, and this goes to Zara's point, which is that what they presented was something called, Zara, was it Steps Towards Abolition? They gave it a weird name, right? Which sounded like abolition, but it was really reformist. And then I think the more radical wing of the organizing came up and said, no, we're not asking for reform, we're asking for outright abolition. So there are now two movements which have sort of similar-ish names, 8 Steps Towards. Yes, DeRay McKesson's was 8 Steps Towards something, right? And then the other group pointed out that this is just reform. We're not interested in reform. We are interested in abolition. So there is that kind of, but the problem is that DeRay McKesson, partly because of his, you know, sartorial choices, but also because he plays the good black radical in public, his message gets much more play in the US than, say, radical factions of BLM or any other sort of radical Black-led organizing that happens here. So there's that issue, and I think, Bradley, that takes it back to what Zara has said and what you asked about in terms of how do these movements play out in real life, right? And how do they play out in another kind of media representational world? Those are the tensions. The tensions are between the non-profitization, which is what DeRay McKesson is really good at, is he gets flown around the world to make speeches about Black radical politics when he's not anything like that. Whereas the other groups doing the real work, its leaders are harassed constantly, are surveilled, and it's harder for them to get funding, for instance. So those tensions exist right now within that world. And where all of that will go is, very much, is very much up in the air. As Zara points out with, her stuff about what's going on in DC. Yeah. And DC not being a state is also very instrumental.
Something that I wanted to ask, like, I think that we've been mimicking it in the UK, but I don't think that it's the revolutionary change that's happening in America. That it's something very different. And I just, like, my take on it could be just completely wrong about why these movements immediately, like, as soon as I saw them, I was really positive about them for a few days, and then as they started to lull, then I sort of thought, well, is it maybe because knowing the revolutionary movements that happened in the past, like King's movement or like Malcolm X, Nation of Islam sort of stuff, that there was something so concrete and something that had to be sacrificed in order to be part of those movements. And the way that I've thought about it in my head, which could be completely wrong, so I would really like to be told that I'm wrong, is that maybe that there's not something substantial behind this. Maybe that the image of celebrity and spectacle is so ingrained into the idea of revolutionary protest practice that people went out onto the streets aiming to protest something, and then that failed because there was no agenda behind it. It was, we want the police abolished, for example, because there was something wrong then, but there was no agenda about how can we recreate something in a new form. And there's been little talks about like community policing in the US, which is being trialed in certain things, but has there been some sort of constructive project which people are willing to sacrifice for, that actually sustains the project beyond just this moment of anger?
Yes. And the thing that I think doesn't get represented in media is the fact that actually a lot of organizations have been doing the work behind the scenes for a very long time. And this is where I wanted to talk about failure, and also perhaps we could also talk about invisibility, right? So some years ago, you know, groups like the one I'm a part of, and Gender Just, which was a very different entity at the time, but this small sort of group did demand that, for instance, cops, there be a reduction of cops in schools, and there'd be more social service, well, and that's a problem in itself as well, but, you know, but more therapeutic resources available to students and so on. So this has been going on for a while. And restorative justice, which is essentially, again, I'm not the best person, you know, to articulate exactly what restorative justice is, but it is a process that's antithetical to policing and surveillance and all of that. But it's a process which is sort of community oriented, which requires a group of people to come together and come up with a solution to, for instance, an instance of violence or something like that, right? Those principles have been you know, propounded and thought about and integrated in different ways in Chicago, at least, that I've seen. Mariam Kaba, who's one of the best known abolitionists, along with Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis. Mariam Kaba was based in Chicago for a very long time. What has happened with some of that is that those have become appropriated by nonprofits, which are now turning out, you know, certification programs in restorative justice, for instance, which almost flies in the face of how these things should come about. But I guess the short answer to that is, I don't know if it's quite an either or, but I think it's a very good point to make, which is that what remains after the glossiness in some ways of the protests and all of that, what happens when that disappears? And as Zara points out, right, in DC certainly, for instance, and we see that also in Chicago, one problem is that the vacuum what might look like a vacuum gets occupied, as it were, by the nonprofit structure, which has a very different agenda, which has nothing revolutionary about it, right, which simply wants to have a structure that creates CEO salaries, et cetera, et cetera. That's a big problem. And the problem with that is that it's very difficult to sustain a movement and change without having some kind of an apparatus, right, that keeps you afloat. I mean, Chicago Freedom School's big thing is, you know, how do we feed our students, many of whom don't get, you know, regular meals perhaps at home, for whom Chicago public schools. So one horrific, I don't know if people in the UK are quite aware of this, but one horrific thing that happened with the pandemic and our public schools, we saw this especially in Chicago, is that when the public schools had to shut down, thousands and thousands of students, school-going children, lost access to the only regular meals they had.
So we have a luncheon voucher here, which got implemented about 3 weeks after lockdown.
Right.
So all of us families that were on free school dinners got a voucher, which we had to go into a shop to pay, but it was like the main supermarkets, it was fine.
We did not have anything like that. So there was at least a couple of days where literally children had no access. And so what was the solution? The solution in Chicago was, let's all, we form mutual aid. Let's all be philanthropic and let's all go to these places and deliver free meals. So it was a charity thing, in other words. The solution was charity. Now, obviously, after a couple of days of high shaming, our Black lesbian mayor, who is nothing like a progressive, caved in and said, okay, shit, I'm going to get real flack for this. So she restarted at least the food program. But the humiliation that people have to endure in this country, that they have to go to a public spot, stand in line, right, for food. It's like the 1930s Dole line.
Yeah.
We've had that for a long time.
The question is that even revolutionary, right? Like being able to offer people stuff which is a basic human need. That doesn't seem like a revolutionary action to me. There's no program behind that. That's just desperation.
Yep, it is the opposite of the revolution. And the problem in the United States is that was seen as a revolutionary act of love. I was so fucking angry about it, and that is what my book is about. Again, shameless hustle here. But essentially, that is what I keep arguing about. This is what against equality is about, right? Is to say this idea that, acts of charity or love are something revolutionary, when what we do need are systems. We do need systemic change and systems that work for people where, like you said, you just got a voucher and you took it to the supermarket. It was dead easy. Something like that here they're even reducing. We do have something called SNAP, which is for mothers and children. It's a food program. We're reducing that and we're forcing people to come and collect the food rations in public, standing in line. I mean, this is the state willfully humiliating people and forcing them to subject themselves in, this position of deep abjection, really. It's horrific.
I don't know, for me, I was claiming food banks about 6 years ago because I had to. I didn't feel a lot of shame in that. It's just something I had to access. But since lockdown, I've ended up moderating a Facebook group, which is the citywide mutual aid.
Mm-hmm.
And actually I found, you were talking earlier about putting your faith in people that you've never met before on the internet. And I've actually joined a group of people and we're all moderating the same mutual aid group on Facebook. And that's been a real empowerment process for me. So yeah, I'm kind of in an interesting place in the lockdown with what that means as kind of being food poor.
And the issue here is also that you and I operate in different systems where we, Zara and I, are in a system where we don't have, and not just us individually, I can't speak for Zara, but the people individually, right? People in general in the US are not supported by a system behind them, which for instance gives healthcare, right? In the US, as you may know, you chip your tooth and you're facing bankruptcy. I mean, every day I walk around, I'm afraid I'll fall because I have no healthcare to speak of, right? And what that might mean, etc. So that's our problem, is that the mutual aid becomes something very resonant for a lot of liberals, progressive lefties, who are all talking about it as this wonderful thing. But it's existing in a system where we have no other kinds of support. So in that sense, it is abjection. It's not abjection in a system where you have healthcare or you have, different kind of other sort of social support systems. We don't have that. We take pride in the fact that we don't have any kinds of support systems, but yay, mutual aid. I mean, I think it's about, is mutual aid the only solution? And in the US, that's the problem. It becomes the solution, and it becomes a long-standing solution, as opposed to a stopgap measure, which we shouldn't have had. Those children should not have gone hungry for a single bloody day, not for a single bloody hour, you know? But yes.
We also had a lot of struggle around the food vouchers because it was going to be stopped for the summer, wasn't it? And then we had like a footballer that got involved, and there was a lot of pressure. So if that hadn't happened, I don't think families would have gone hungry. And I think there are still families that there's a law that says no recourse to public funds. So certain people that have moved to the country can't claim public funds, so they cannot get access to it.
This is the shame of our class system. This is fucking appalling.
I would love to talk about class in the UK versus class in the US.
So that's the end of part 1. Please look out for part 2, in which we'll be talking about class, polyamory, and love. If you'd like this and you'd like to check out more, please visit www.explodingappendix.com. On that site, you will also be able to find the first volume of the Exploding Appendix dossier is now online. It's themed around topics of revolution, art, and manifestos. Exploding Appendix: Ideas and Culture with Guts. Where is the sun that shone on my head? The sun in my life, it is dead, it is dead. Where is the light that would play on the streets? Where are the friends I could meet, I could meet? Where are the girls I left all behind? The sticks and the specks of the girls on my mind. Where is the sun that shone on my head? The sun in my life, it is dead, it is dead. Where are the girls I left all behind? The spicks and the specks of the girls on my mind. Where are the girls I left all behind? The spicks and the specks of the girls on my mind. Where is the girl that I loved all along? The girl that I loved. She is gone, she is gone. All of my life I call yesterday. The spicks and the specks of my life gone away. All of my life I call yesterday. The spicks and the specks of my life gone away. The spicks and the specks. The spicks and the specks.